Episode 2. Brewing Poison. Brewing Change. The morning sun crept gently across the marbled floor of the Sinclair estate, pouring gold through the towering windows of the grand dining room. Light pooled around polished silverware and fresh-cut blooms, roses, lilies, violets, each placed with care at the long table that seemed too formal for comfort. The hush of wealth pressed into every corner, and yet beneath the stillness, something darker stirred. In the heart of the kitchen, where the warmth of the hearth met the clatter of plates, a maid moved with an eerie precision. Her hands didn't tremble as she reached into the folds of her apron and drew out a small cloth pouch. Worn and stained, she glanced once over her shoulder. No one was watching. From between her fingers, she pinched a fine, pale powder, so light it almost vanished in air, and let it fall into a single teacup. The granules dissolved with a gentle swirl of her spoon. No change in color, no scent, nothing to betray its presence. She placed the cup on a tray beside warm croissants, delicately sliced fruit, and linen napkins folded like lilies. With practiced grace, she carried the tray into the dining room. There, seated with unshakable poise at the head of the table, sat the Duke and Duchess of Sinclair. Their expressions were carved from civility, pleasant, but impenetrable. At their side were Lord Reginald and Lady Beatrice, Adrian's uncle and aunt, cloaked in refined elegance and sharper smiles. Every movement, every glance was calculated. Lady Evelyne Langford entered, her steps light, almost tentative. She wore a soft dove-gray gown, modest and elegant, a pearl brooch fastened at her collar. Her chestnut hair, held in place with delicate pins, glimmered faintly in the sun. Though her posture was graceful, her fingers were curled tightly in her lap as she took her seat beside Adrian. Across the table, the space between them felt cold and vast. He did not look at her. The clink of cutlery began the ritual of breakfast. Porcelain touched porcelain. Voices murmured pleasantries. But behind every smile, Evelyne felt the weight of scrutiny pressing against her skin. "Welcome to the family, my dear," said Duchess Eleanor, raising her cup with a smile so soft it might have seemed kind, if not for the chill behind her eyes. "Yes," the Duke added, his tone wrapped in authority. "We trust you will uphold the dignity of our house." Evelyne smiled with the gentle restraint expected of her. "Of course," she replied, her voice even. "It is an honor." She reached for her tea. The cup was smooth, delicate, a pale porcelain touched with gold. The scent rising from it was floral, lavender and rose, with a faint, bitter undertone she could not name. She took a sip. Nothing burned, nothing choked. But the bitterness lingered, just beneath the surface. Across the table, Adrian Sinclair sat stiff and unreadable, his icy blue eyes trained on nothing in particular. If he noticed the subtle change in her expression, he gave no sign. He barely seemed present, his thoughts clearly elsewhere. The conversation drifted. Lady Beatrice asked about Evelyne's upbringing in polite tones, and Lord Reginald offered dry remarks on politics, none of which invited opinion. Evelyne answered where needed, smiled when appropriate, and sipped again. Her chest felt tight, though she didn't know if it was the tea, or simply the room. No one mentioned love. No one asked if she was happy. The breakfast, long and lavish, passed like a test where no answers were ever enough. And as Evelyne set her cup down, unaware of the poison winding quietly through her veins, she told herself, again, that she could endure anything. She had to. The midday sun spilled through tall windows, casting golden light across polished tables and porcelain cups. The soft hum of conversation and the clinking of silver spoons filled the small, elegant coffee shop, nestled at the edge of town. A world, far removed from the cold marble halls of the Sinclair estate. Lord Adrian Sinclair sat stiffly at a corner table, his hands wrapped around a porcelain cup he hadn't truly tasted. He wasn't sure why he had come. Perhaps curiosity, perhaps guilt, or perhaps a need to see the past one last time. Across from him sat Lady Cassandra Fairmont, the very image of composed beauty. She wore an emerald green gown that set off the rich warmth of her porcelain skin, and her auburn hair was pinned just loose enough to appear effortless. She leaned in slightly, her every movement deliberate, like a dancer returning to a stage she once ruled. Her laughter, soft and honeyed, curled around his silence like a familiar perfume. "Adrian," she said sweetly, twisting a lock of hair around her finger. "Surely you haven't forgotten all the good times we shared?" Adrian's jaw tensed. He stirred his coffee, eyes fixed on the swirl of cream, as if it might offer him a way out of the moment. "We had our time, Cassandra," he said, voice low and distant. "But it's over. It's been over for a while." Her smile flickered, just a brief tremor, but she recovered quickly. She reached across the table, her fingers brushing his hand with a softness too intimate for what they now were. Her voice lowered, smooth and deliberate. "You and we're not done, Adrian," she whispered. "I know you better than anyone. You just need to remember." She began tracing soft circles against the back of his hand, her touch slow, sensual, an echo of old rhythms meant to stir forgotten feelings. But Adrian's hand tensed beneath hers, and then he pulled away. The sound of his cup settling back onto its saucer echoed quietly between them. He looked at her now, truly looked, and what she saw in his eyes wasn't anger. It was distance. "I'm married," he said flatly. Her expression hardened, the polished veneer cracking just enough to reveal the sting beneath. "You married a girl you barely know," she hissed, voice low, sharp, bitter. "Is that love, Adrian, or just obedience to your father?" Adrian rose, his chair pushing back with a quiet scrape. For a moment he hesitated, as if some part of him remembered what they had once been. But only for a moment. Without a word, he turned and walked away. Cassandra sat frozen, her cup untouched. Around her, the gentle murmur of the coffee shop carried on, oblivious. But within her, a storm brewed, quiet, cold, and resolute. Her fingers curled tightly around the edge of the table. Her eyes never left the door where he had vanished. And, in the silence that followed, a vow took shape behind her painted lips. "I will not lose him again." The afternoon light filtered dimly through the tall windows of Sinclair Estate, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floors. The halls, silent but not still, seemed to breathe with old secrets, whispers tucked between stone and memory. Evelyne moved softly through the corridor, a slender book held against her chest. Her gown, pale blue trimmed with ivory lace, swayed gently with each step. She looked every bit the noble wife she was meant to be, composed, elegant, untouchable. But inside, she still felt like a stranger. As she neared the back hallway by the kitchens, a sound halted her steps. Laughter, low, feminine, the unmistakable cadence of gossip. Evelyne turned slightly, her gaze settling on the half-open door beyond which two maids were busily polishing silverware. Their voices slipped through the gap like wind through a crack in the wall. "You know Lady Cassandra and Lord Adrian were nearly married, don't you?" one whispered, tone tinged with excitement. If not for the old arrangement between the grandfathers, it would have been her at Sinclair Estate now, the other replied, with the authority of someone repeating a well-known truth. Evelyne's fingers tightened slightly around her book. She remained where she was. Her posture relaxed to the eye, but her stillness was too perfect, too careful, as if she were trying not to shatter. She lifted her arms slowly, adjusting her sleeve with practiced grace, pretending to fix the lace at the cuff. But the words had already taken root, slipping past her defenses, blooming like poison beneath her ribs. Of course he had someone else. A name now had a face. Cassandra. Beautiful, poised and of noble blood. Someone Adrian had chosen, once. Not forced upon him by duty or family obligation. Someone who fit. Evelyne felt the ache begin to tighten in her chest. Quiet, dull, but persistent. It wasn't quite jealousy. It didn't even hurt. It was something more fragile. Something like being uninvited. She took a slow breath, steadying her face into its usual calm mask. Whatever had existed between Adrian and Cassandra, whatever might still linger, it was not her place to question it. Their marriage was not a love story. It was a bargain. With a quiet, deliberate step, Evelyne moved forward, past the door, past the voices, past the unspoken truths that no one meant for her to hear. She reached the doors that opened into the estate gardens, her fingers brushing the latch. The sunlight greeted her gently, warm against her skin, but it did nothing to ease the heaviness she carried inside. She stepped into the open air with her head held high, but in her heart, a silence began to bloom. The rose garden basked in golden morning light, petals blushing in hues of soft pink, crimson, and ivory. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves, carrying the scent of blooms and the distant murmur of estate life. It was a scene carved from serenity, yet, at the center of it sat a young woman adrift in a storm. Evelyne sat quietly on a carved stone bench, her gown pooling elegantly at her feet. A leather-bound book rested on her lap, untouched. Her fingers grazed the pages absently, but her eyes no longer saw the words. They almost married. It could have been hers. The whispers echoed louder than the birdsong, threading through her thoughts like a haunting refrain. Sunlight filtered through the trellised vines above, painting dappled shadows on her skin. It should have warmed her, but Evelyne felt cold, disoriented, as though her mind were wrapped in gauze. A light dizziness made the garden sway slightly before her eyes. She closed the book and tilted her face to the sun, searching for clarity in the brightness. But only more questions came. Cassandra, the woman who nearly became Lady Sinclair. What did she look like? What did she sound like when she laughed with him? Evelyne didn't need to be told. She imagined her easily. Tall, graceful, radiant. A woman born into power and confidence. A woman who would never be mistaken for an outsider. Was she as composed as Adrian's mother? As elegant as his aunt? Did she carry herself with the same piercing chill masked as nobility? Evelyne's breath hitched as insecurity curled within her. She had been raised with grace and intelligence, yes, but never with the expectation of dazzling. Her family's lineage, though noble, lacked the weight of the Sinclairs. She was the granddaughter of a respected gentleman, not the daughter of a duchess. This marriage was not born of affection. It was a relic of duty, a vow spoken by old men in old rooms, not hearts in bloom. And if that vow had never existed, would Adrian have ever looked at me? The thought struck like an arrow, silent but sharp. She imagined his eyes, icy blue like winter clouds, crinkling softly with warmth, but not for her, for Cassandra. A flash of them together rose unbidden. Cassandra's hand resting on his arm with practiced familiarity, his head bent close, a rare smile meant only for her. Evelyne's stomach twisted. Had Adrian ever looked at her that way? With anything more than obligation? The ache in her chest grew heavier. Jealousy flickered, quick, shameful, and real. She tried to brush it away. She was his wife now. The vows had been spoken. The ink was dry. Cassandra had no place in their present. And yet, in her mind, Cassandra stood like a ghost just behind the curtain, always watching, always waiting. Evelyne's hands clenched slightly around the book, her knuckles pale, her heartbeat unsteady. "Why am I thinking like this?" she scolded herself. "This is not who I am." But the whispers had found root, and doubt, quiet, creeping, doubt was beginning to bloom. She closed her eyes tightly, fighting back the burning sting at their corners. She would not cry. She would not tremble. That was not the role she had been raised to play. When she opened her eyes again, the garden remained unchanged. Roses still bloomed in patient silence, as if untouched by human sorrow. Evelyne drew a slow breath, letting it settle deep in her chest. The mask of composure slid gently back into place. I am his wife. That must be enough. She looked upward toward the endless sky, trying to steady the trembling inside her. But deep within, she felt, in the first crack in the wall she had so carefully built, and she knew this was only the beginning. The long hallway of Sinclair Estate was drenched in amber light, cast through the tall arched windows lining the stone walls. The afternoon had turned still, so still that even the sound of Adrian's footsteps on the polished floor seemed to echo like a whisper through the grand silence. As he passed by the window overlooking the garden, he slowed, then stopped. There, beyond the glass, sat Evelyne. She didn't see him. She was seated alone on the stone bench near the roses, her book forgotten beside her, her posture softer than he had ever seen. No longer upright with duty or caution, only present, still, lost in thought. Sunlight filtered through the trees and played gently over her figure, turning the chestnut in her hair to threads of gold. The faintest breeze tugged at a ribbon in her hair. For a moment, she looked like a painting, like something untouchable and quiet, ethereal. Adrian's gaze lingered. He had watched her before, of course, at meals, in shared silences, during strained conversations. But never like this. Never without the veil of formality between them. There was something in her expression now that stirred an ache in him, not of pain, but recognition. She is not just enduring, she is trying to live. He didn't know how long. He stood there, unnoticed, long enough for something unfamiliar to begin to stir beneath the surface of his carefully composed heart. A flicker of warmth, a question without words, a shift, and just as suddenly as the moment arrived, it was gone. He blinked, and the silence between them returned to what it had always been: distance. Without another glance, he turned and continued down the hall. His steps resumed their steady rhythm. But somewhere beneath the surface of that quiet, unreadable face, something had changed. Small, but vital.